Welcome to our talk on getting the most out of your vegetable garden. I am Cassie Anderson. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator in Adams County, and I love talking about plants and especially vegetables, so it's kind of fun to be able to chat with all of you today. Definitely, like I said, if you have questions, keep note of them. We will open the chat box up near the end of my talk, and we'll be able to have a little bit of a discussion at the end. I'm thinking the talk will last for about half an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and that kind of thing at the end. Like I said, we will be keeping you muted and keeping your videos off. That way it's just less distracting for all of us, and we will be able to kind of just go from there. I'm sure many of you have already been on a lot of Zoom classes, but if you're not familiar, Zoom has had a little bit of a history of some Zoom bombing or people doing inappropriate things on Zoom. So if something does happen, we will stop the Zoom and we will get things started up again. You can re-admit yourself in with the same link that you used before, but that's just kind of the process we'll do it if something weird goes on. Not looking anticipating that anything will happen, but just letting you guys know, kind of giving you a bit of a heads up. So I'll kind of chat for a few more minutes because it looks like we're still having quite a few people coming in and joining us. Definitely this week our weather pattern has changed. We're no longer in the nice cool spring season. We've started hitting 90 degrees. We've started getting warmer. So our season for vegetable crops in particular is definitely shifting and changing. And hopefully I can give you some information that can give you a little bit of an arsenal to help out in that respect as we move forward with the gardens. I think I will probably now get myself started. So like I said, this is talk for getting the most out of your vegetable garden, and we will be recording this. So if you have questions or things that you didn't quite catch or you want to watch it again, it will be hosted on our Master Gardener YouTube page, which you can access through our Facebook page as well. And we will have it up on the cohorts blog as well, if that's how you came to find us. So with that, I will get started. So today we are going to assume that you've already gotten your vegetable garden started and that you've got some plants up, that you're getting things going. So we'll cover a little bit of basics of what to do once things have gotten started. We'll look at fertilizing your garden and mulching your garden and why that is important and useful. We'll look at irrigation. We'll talk very briefly about weeds and briefly about harvest. And I also have a few slides in about how to care for your plants as you harvest them. I'm not going to be getting into a species or crop specific discussion on how to harvest or when to harvest, just because in half an hour I really don't have time. But we will get started with fertilizers. So if you think about it, in a natural ecosystem, nothing gets fertilized, but that's because nothing's getting taken out. Old plants are dying and recycling their nutrients in for the new plants. In a vegetable garden, that's not the case. We are taking all of these plants, we take them out, and then we consume them. So we need to be putting inputs back into the garden. And it doesn't matter how you're putting that input in, so long as you are doing so. So the nutrient needs are very dependent on the crop that you're working with and dependent on where that crop is at. Usually crops are going to need most of their fertilizer right at the start, right when they're flowering, and sometimes right when they're fruiting. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about how you're fertilizing. Generally speaking, you're not going to notice when you're starting to get a deficiency until after you've already had a deficiency. Usually it's going to reduce the quality of the crop that you get. And this is where I'll put my first of several plugs of it's really important to get a soil test to know what's going on in your soil. We don't want to put in a whole bunch of nitrogen or a whole bunch of phosphorus or potassium or anything like that unless we already know that we have a deficiency. If you start putting stuff in before you really need it, then you can cause many, many problems as well. So generally speaking, when we're talking about fertilizer, we're talking about these three macronutrients. We're talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the three nutrients that plants use in their highest quantity. And amongst these three, nitrogen is really one of the very most important. It is the nutrient that plants really, really need in the greatest quantity. And it's also one that is what we call mobile in the soil. So it actually will move through the soil and it leaches through with water. And so it's not one that sticks around from year to year. We always need to be growing nitrogen. Nitrogen is usually involved in helping plants produce leafy and green growth. And like it says here, it's one of the most limiting macronutrients in our soils, and it's the one that we probably care about the most. When you're reading a plant label, there's three numbers, or a plant fertilizer label, excuse me, there are three numbers on the front, and when you're reading it, the very first one is your nitrogen number. So if it's 10, 10, 10, then it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so it's kind of a good way to know how much of each you're putting down. Sometimes you only need nitrogen, so you might find something that is just 2400, and that's perfectly fine if that's what the needs of your soil are. And that's when I go back to that, having that soil test to know what your needs are is really useful and important. Oh, and I forgot to mention, yes, if you are an Adams County employee, you are able to take this class for credit, but Eric just put in the chat a link for you to type in your information so that we can send that on to Adams County so they know you've taken the class. So go ahead and click on that link. And I think he will post it near the end as well. So next up is our phosphorus. Phosphorus is important for plants to produce energy, and also for the production of root and flower and fruit production. Generally, phosphorus is the second most important limiting macronutrient in our soils. It's also one that is not often quite as available when we have cold soils or wet soils, which hasn't been quite as much of an issue this year. We had that really intense freeze in April, but then we have kind of been pretty steadily warm and not very, very wet this spring. So that phosphorus is a little bit more limited, or a little bit less limited than nitrogen, but it is fairly decent in some of our soils. So that's one that's really important to have a soil test, to know where your phosphorus levels are. And then the third macronutrient is potassium. Potassium is involved in the movement of water, nutrients, and carbohydrates in the plant system. It also is important for regulating the active photosynthesis, opening and closing of stomata, the tiny pores in plant leaves that assist in transpiration. And plants that are sufficient in potassium have a much higher disease resistance and tolerance to drought. Generally speaking, potassium is one that our plants are able to get sufficient levels from our soil naturally. So it's not one that we usually need very much of. So when you're looking at your fertilizer labels, if you find one that has the first two numbers and then 0 is the last number, that's okay, unless you've done a soil test and found that potassium is limited in your soil. So generally speaking, the type of fertilizer that you're going to be working on is dependent on what your goals are, what you want to get from your garden. We have folks ask all the time, what's better? Is it better to use an organic fertilizer? Is it better to use a conventional fertilizer? Really, the plants themselves are not very picky. They're not particular whether it comes from an organic source or from a synthetic source. What is different is how quickly the nitrogen is available, how much of the nitrogen is available, and the price of the product. Generally speaking, something like a Miracle-Gro product is going to have a lot more nitrogen. It's going to be more readily available to the plants in a shorter timeline. It's also much easier to burn your plants if you're using a conventional fertilizer. Organic fertilizers are going to have a lower level of nitrogen, so you would need to apply more to get the same amount as a synthetic. And they usually will also be more expensive. And so it really is completely up to you what type of fertilizer you want to use. I've used both in my own yard. They both work perfectly fine. But it's just something that's good to be aware of as you're planning it out. And of course, it's also good to know what kind of soil you have. If you've got a clay soil that holds materials quite a bit, nitrogen is going to hold into that. Those smaller pores hold on to nutrients a lot better, a lot more tightly than a sandy or a coarser soil will. And so if you have a clay soil, you won't have to fertilize quite as often as if you have a sandy soil. So it's good just to kind of know where you stand. And this is something that any extension office is going to be happy to help you with if you've got questions about your soil. If you get a soil test and you're not sure how to read it or how to apply the information, they will be very happy to help out with that. So you know that you've got the fertilizer you want. Now, how much do you apply? If you've done a soil test, then usually the soil lab will have given you some recommendations, or you've worked with your extension office to give you some recommendations. But generally speaking, and I was looking up at a lot of different fact sheets, there's a bit of a range of how much nitrogen you put into a vegetable garden. Generally speaking, it's somewhere between 2 pounds of nitrogen to 5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet of garden space. And that is obviously going to depend upon the amount of organic matter that's already in your soil. Organic matter, as it breaks down, naturally mineralizes out nitrogen, and that nitrogen is available to plants. If you have a lot of organic matter, up to 4 to 5% of your soil property, then you're not going to need to apply much, if any, nitrogen to your soil. If you have very, very low organic matter, then you will need to apply quite a bit more nitrogen to your soil. And once again, this is where knowing your soil test, knowing what your soil needs is really important. Generally speaking, we recommend doing a soil test every couple of years, just so that you kind of have a baseline knowledge of what you need to be putting into your garden, because we don't want to be putting too much in. If you put too much fertilizer down, it can leach out and cause other problems outside of your garden space or in our groundwater, which are things we just don't want to do. And also if it stays in your soil, in excess nutrients can cause problems for a lot of our plants as they are growing as well. So for the growing season, once you have started things off, typically you will have some nitrogen or some nutrients, you'll put them in at planting, and usually you then broadcast or use a water-soluble fertilizer or side dressing to amend with some additional fertilizer as those plants grow and get bigger and need more resources. Some of the crops that need more nitrogen are corn, potatoes, and cole crops, which are like broccoli and cauliflower and cabbages, are going to be fairly heavy feeders of nitrogen. And we've got we're happy to work with you on specific crops. Like I said, I just don't have time in this talk to get into the details. There's a couple different ways that you can fertilize after your plants are growing. You can broadcast and side dress, which, if in this bottom picture, is where you kind of put little furrows 2 to 4 inches to the side of your seed bed, and kind of mix it in a little bit and then water it in really well, avoiding getting the fertilizer splashed up onto the leaves. All right, so that was quick and dirty for fertilizers for your garden. Next, I'm going to get into mulching your vegetable gardens. Mulch is a broad term for any kind of material that you're applying to the soil surface. It's not an amendment. Amendments are those that we turn into the soil before we start planting. Mulches can be synthetic. They can also be non-synthetic or organic materials. This is organic in the chemical sense, not in the OMRI certified organic sense. And what type of mulch you use depends on the goals of the mulch itself, whether you want to warm the soil, keep the soil cool, whether you want to encourage crop production or discourage weeds. There's a lot of different applications for mulch, and we'll kind of go briefly through a lot of those applications. So generally speaking, mulch is going to be very good at buffering your soil temperatures. If you put it down before the soil warms up, it keeps it a lot cooler. It warms up much more slowly. If you want to keep that soil warm, you can wait until the soil has warmed and then you put the mulch on, and it kind of acts as a little bit of an insulator, and it will keep the water or the soil warm for a little bit longer. It's also really nice for keeping your produce clean. Even if you use drip emitters or a drip irrigation system, you can still get a little bit of splash from raindrops or something, so that you get dust and grit on your produce. This is especially common on lettuce leaves. You get that little bit of gritty splashback material, and so you can have a little bit of complications there if you aren't careful with your mulching. It also is very good at retaining moisture. I see this and I'm amazed by it every single year. If I put mulch down and I lift it up or I push it away, and that soil, even a few days or up to a week if it's one of my perennial beds, after watering, the soil can still be nice and moist near the top, and that can be really, really nice. That said, that's if you're using an organic mulch. If you're using a synthetic, like a plastic mulch, then that can actually act as a barrier so that moisture doesn't get in. So that's something to be aware of as you're planning. Mulch is also very good at weed management. Generally speaking, if you have a nice thick layer of mulch, a lot of those seeds will not germinate because they're not getting the light and the resources that they need to germinate. Or if they do germinate, then they have to grow up through 2 or 3 inches of mulch. They've got that long, thin stem, and they're much easier to pull out at that point. Mulch also can protect your soil surface. It can prevent erosion, it can prevent crusting. This is something that I struggle with every year in my garden when I'm planting things like carrots, because I'm not always the best at mulching in the early season. Sometimes it's hard to time the mulching correctly. And so mulch can help prevent crusting, which can help with seed germination as you're getting things started. One of our really easy resources for mulch is grass clippings. If you are the type to bag your grass and you're not treating it, and I'll get onto that in the next slide, grass in thin layers that you allow to dry in between applications is a really nice mulch for your vegetable garden. You do want to make sure that you apply it in thin layers, not more than an inch or so at a time, and let it dry before you put more on, because if you have thick layers, then you're more likely to start the process of composting, and it's going to get stinky and it's going to get kind of slimy and gross and not be a very nice, pleasant mulch for your garden. You're not going to want to spend a lot of time around it. If you do go with something like a grass, you can put newspaper underneath that grass. Usually aim for putting about 2 sheets of newspaper underneath. Any more of that can cause some problems in your soil, like a nitrogen imbalance. Newspaper is nice because it really effectively blocks that light to prevent any weed seeds from germinating. If you do use newspaper, you can definitely use the standard even colored newsprint, but you do want to avoid using the glossy inserts, the adverts, because those inks might not be quite as safe. Most newspapers, even the colored matte flat newspaper sections, are printed with a soy-based ink, so they break down really nicely in our gardens. It's a pretty good way to go if you want to. If you are using grass clippings, definitely be careful and know your source and know the history of the lawn. Don't go down a random street and see some bags of grass and pick them up without asking questions, because there are certain weeds that will be persistent in the grass, and so they will be problematic for your garden. So it's definitely something to be aware of. If you are treating your lawn, wait at least 4 weeks after you treat before you use it for any kind of mulch in your vegetable garden, before you use any of the clippings. So you would treat, wait 4 weeks, and then you mow the lawn and use those clippings 4 weeks later. Also, if you have a very weedy lawn, then it's important to use mulch, or to not use those grass clippings, because you're likely to be adding a whole bunch of weed seed into your vegetable garden, which I don't know about you, but I don't want to add more weeds into my garden. I've got enough in there already. Straw mulch is a really good option. It's just a little bit hard to find. It works really well around established plants. You don't want to use it necessarily on new seed beds. It can provide a little bit of soil temperature insulation, and because straw is relatively dense, it's not one that we want to turn into the soil. It's also can be a little bit tricky to source sometimes, like I said, and you do want to make sure if you're sourcing it that you get weed-free straw. Otherwise, you end up with a whole lot of grass mulch all over the place, and so that can be problematic. Like I said, you want it to be certified weed-free. There are a whole bunch of persistent pesticides that are used in a lot of our straws, like clopyralid, aminopyralid, and picloram. These are all persistent herbicides that are used in pastures, and they will transmit to your crops. Usually we see it in tomatoes first. We'll start seeing tomatoes cupping. We'll start seeing crops be really, really small. We might see some of your seedlings die. And so it's just something to be aware of. That's one reason that it's really good to find a weed seed-free crop. And if you can find one that's organic, that's a good way to go as well. Mulch that is wood or bark chips is a really good option for your vegetable garden, but only in pathways. It's not one that we usually recommend for putting on top of your bed because you really don't want to turn this into your soil. It throws off the nutrient balance in your soil in a way that I don't have time to get into today. But you don't want to turn it in, and it's just messy. So this is a good one for walkways. Have it 4+ inches deep, but not in your beds, in your actual garden beds. Plastic mulches are a good option, especially for weed control and for soil temperature improvements. Generally, there's a bunch of different colors you can get. You can get black, white, or clear. Some can be colored or reflective, and they have benefits for like insects and such. They are a little bit more problematic in terms of disposal. There are some products out there that are biodegradable, but they're a little bit more questionable, and rarely can you find a place that will recycle the plastic mulches. Generally speaking though, if you're looking to reduce weeds, you want any mulch that is not clear. The picture in the bottom here is a really good example of a plastic mulch that's used in, this was a large scale vegetable production, those are tomatoes, but it's really good at reducing those weeds and keeping it clear so that you don't have to be fighting the weeds back for crop production. If you're wanting to solarize your soil, that's when you would use a clear plastic mulch. Clear plastic mulch is not going to be very good for growing your vegetable garden because things still germinate underneath there just fine. So it's not going to help with weed reduction. If you want to keep your soil nice and cool, a white plastic could be good, but not all crops are going to grow very well under white plastic mulch. If you are going to install plastic mulch, there's a few important things to know. You want to install your drip irrigation first with your emitters in the appropriate locations. You really do need good soil contact. You don't want the wind to be able to get up in and blow around underneath the mulch. So you want to make sure it's stretched taut. You can kind of mound the soil in the middle so that it stretches over. You can bury the edges with soil, or you can staple or stake the edges down. When you're creating your planting holes, you can see it here. You want to cut an entire hole. A lot of times you'll hear just to make an X so that the plant can grow and it's fine, but you don't want to do that because you don't want to have the plastic cutting the sides of touching the sides of the plant itself, because that can cause problems for the plant. So cutting a physical hole, you might get some weeds that you have to pull up in that hole, but it's going to be much better for the plant overall. All right, on to irrigating the vegetable garden. I'm talking way too much. I need to go a little quicker. Generally speaking, the purpose of irrigation is to replace the water that your plants are losing through both evaporation and transpiration. This is a term we call ET. Evaporation is water loss from the soil and plant surfaces. Transpiration is water loss from the plant itself. Generally speaking, if you're not watering enough, you're definitely going to reduce your crop quality and your crop yield. You should always be checking your soil moisture, even if you have an automated system. Generally speaking, unless you're going on vacation, it's sometimes better if you just pop your system on yourself as water is needed, instead of just having it be automated. but you can't reduce how much water vegetable crops need. There is no such thing as a xeric vegetable garden, a drought-tolerant xeric garden. They just don't play along with each other. You're asking these plants to grow quickly, to throw a crop that we can then eat. We want good, effective production from them. So reducing water in the vegetable garden is not the place to reduce. Timing, you definitely can use a timer, but it does need to be able to shift with the season. Sometimes you'll use up to 60% less water in the spring and the fall as you do in the peak heat of summer. And you also water differently depending on what your soil texture or soil structure is, or what stage your plant is in. A really big mature tomato plant is obviously going to use a lot more water than a little tiny one with 4 leaves that has just established. So keeping your watering schedule flexible is really important. It's important to know kind of the critical periods in which your plant needs water. Like I mentioned this a while ago, but for fertilizer, but it applies for water as well. Plants need water when they're germinating, when you transplant them, and when they're preparing to fruit and to flower. Generally speaking, beans are one of our thirstiest crops. Corn, for example, when it's tasseling, when it's throwing out those silks, is going to need a lot more water, as well as when it's starting to develop kernels. And things like lettuces and cole crops are going to need really consistent, steady water so that you keep that good sweet flavor and you don't just get the bitterness coming through. Generally speaking, crops use around a 1/4 inch of water a day during the heat of summer. If you are overhead watering, you can measure this pretty easily using a straight-sided can and replace how much water is lost every few days. That said, it is usually better to let the soil surface dry between irrigations. Your fingers are really good tools for letting you know when the soil is what the soil moisture is. The very, very surface of the soil is not going to help you with anything. You can have watered really well and have a very nice moist soil, and it will look dry and crusty on top if you don't have a mulch on. Put your finger up to its first knuckle down into the soil and kind of wiggle it around and feel what the soil feels like down there. You'll start to get a good feel of how moist it is over time. If you don't have an irrigation system set up yet, drip irrigation is a great way to go. It could reduce your water use up to 50%, but it does need a clean water source, relatively short runs. You can't do an entire 40 by 40 garden on one drip line spread the whole way. And you do need to be careful about pressure and all of that. We do have some good resources on drip irrigation if you're interested in that. And here's just a little list if you want to take a moment and take a screenshot or something like that. We might also be able to send out a list of these components. We also do have a very good fact sheet on setting up a drip system, but it's pretty easy to do. They're fairly plug and play at this point, which is kind of nice. Drip irrigations usually are going to be more expensive to start with, but it sure beats going out there with a hose and spray watering the plants overhead, because they just don't tolerate that very well. All right, quick little discussion on weeds. Weeds can definitely become overwhelming in a garden. This is actually my garden. I took this picture this week. Well, it's just outside of my garden. I took this picture this week. Once those soils warm up, a lot of our perennial weeds become really, really problematic. Regular weeding, this is meaning at least once, if not several times a week, go out and spend a little bit of time pulling out the weeds in your garden. If you don't let them get to this stage, you're going to have a lot easier time of getting them out and keeping them out. Make sure that you're getting as much of the root system out as possible. For a perennial plant like this bindweed, that can be really difficult. Bindweed have roots that can go many, many feet deep, but you do the best you can. And for perennial plants like these, it can be useful to pull repeatedly. If you don't want to use chemical controls, your main combat here is either something like a plastic mulch or repeated pulling, repeated maintenance, exhausting that root supply. Generally speaking, it's also good to identify whether or not your weeds are an annual or a perennial. This can help inform your control options. Annual plants are a lot easier to pull out. They have a smaller root system, but there might be a lot more of them. whereas perennial plants usually have a longer, more intense root system, which might be a little harder to get out. So it's important to kind of know what weeds you have. That way you can have the better controls for how to work with them. All right, so you've got your plants, they're growing well, you're getting them, oh, sorry, I have a train going by. Your plants are getting good water, they're getting good food when they need it, but not too much, and you're starting to get produce. What now? You want to make sure when you're thinking about harvesting that you're aware vegetables continue to be alive after you have harvested them. You don't cut that lettuce head off and instantly it's dead. They are still metabolizing. So slight changes in how you're managing and how you're harvesting them can make a difference in the flavor and in the nutrition of the plant. The faster you can get it out of the garden and cooled and preferably in your stomach, the more nutritious and better flavored they will be. Generally speaking, 3 golden rules: keep it cool, keep it wet, handle it with care. So generally speaking, the slower you can get that respiration, the longer those are going to live. Cool your vegetables down. For every 18 degrees that a plant is warmer, respiration is going to increase between 2 and 4 times. So if possible, harvest in the early morning or late in the evening. When the vegetable is coolest, can cut the respiration up to half. If possible, keep it out of the sun. I used to work at a CSA and that wasn't possible. We would have buckets like you see here that were full of cold water. We would harvest most of our stuff straight out of the soil, put it straight into the cold water, and then lug it back to our processing shed, which was out of the sun. Some of our crops, the dry crops, are going to need to be in a warm, or they're going to need to be cured in order to have a longer shelf life. This just means you're giving them a short time in a warm, dry place. It toughens their skin and dries their surface and helps them have some longevity. This is for crops like potatoes and pumpkins, winter squash. Onions, for example, need about a week and dry temperatures, 70 to 80 degrees out of the sun. Sweet potatoes are going to need the same amount at a slightly higher temperature with a little bit of humidity, ideally, if you can. Okay, I think Eric can probably open up the chat because I'm just going to talk really briefly about some options for season extension, and then we will be able to answer questions as you have them come in. I did get through it not too far over half an hour, so that was didn't quite know if I would. So this is a great time of year to start thinking about whether or not you want to extend your season. There's a lot of ways that you can do this. You can build something like in this picture, a window cold frame, where you just have sides that go around your bed and an old window that is on hinges that you can open up or close, depending on temperature. This is one, if it's warm, then you want to have that opened up for sure. Another option is a floating row cover. That can usually give you between 2 and 4 degrees of protection from frost. Not very much, but maybe enough if we're dipping down into the 30s at night. If you add plastic and Christmas tree lights, the old warm bulb ones, incandescent bulbs, not CFLs or not LEDs, they will give you sometimes up to 18 degrees of frost protection. If you get a little bit fancier, then you can get into building hoop houses. These are going to cover larger areas. They can be low tunnels that you can't get into, and that gives you a little bit of insulation and extension. Once again, with these, you want to make sure that you can open them up because they will get very, very warm. And so I thought I had one more picture, but I don't. And so these you can put over raised beds or you can put them over in-ground beds. They can be as small or as large as you would like in order to get the goals that you need to extend your season out. All right, I will put up the question slide and pop over here and take a look at what our questions are. Oh, all kinds of things. Yes, we are recording this, so you will be able to view it again. We'll get it captioned and up onto our Facebook page and up onto the cohorts page hopefully as well. I had a question about what did I say about wood mulch? Wood mulch is great in pathways. It's not so great in a vegetable garden on the surface. The best organic method for controlling bindweed is that, like I talked about, persistent pulling, or if you can shade it out, outcompete it. Mulch can be somewhat effective, but you will still need to pull. Where can I get a soil test? CSU Extension does soil tests. There's also Ward Labs, Weld Labs, and Midwest Labs will all do soil tests as well, and they're all around the $30 to $40 price point. For paths and areas you want to keep weeds out of, plastic or landscape fabric under the mulch, honestly, I wouldn't recommend either, because you still get dust and debris that settles on top of landscape fabrics, and then you'll get weeds on top of your landscape fabric, and it will be more of a pain in the butt. So unfortunately, it is better to just have a really thick, if you can get it 6+ inches layer of mulch, that's going to give you a lot better benefit. What do you do if you have soil that looks like they've amended the wood chip mulch into it? That's a little bit longer of a discussion than we can really get into, but essentially it's going to take time. You're going to have to wait until those wood chips get broken down, and you're going to need to make sure that you're adding nitrogen in, because the microbes are breaking down the carbon, and they're taking all of the available nitrogen out of the soil. So make sure, if you want to grow plants in that, you'll need to make sure that you add in extra nitrogen. Good resources to learn how to harvest veggies without harming the plant. A really sharp knife or a good pair of scissors is going to be a really good bet for yourself there. And I thought very briefly about getting in to talk about harvesting plants, but that could be an hour and a half talk in and of itself. So if you're thinking like harvesting a head of lettuce, a sharp knife at the base. If you're harvesting peppers or tomatoes, clipping with a pair of scissors. Same with beans, clip with a pair of scissors. It's going to be much, much nicer on the plant if you clip or cut than if you are pulling things off. Is a soil pH tester a good way to test soil, or is sending a sample the only option? Soil pH testers are not very accurate, so really sending a soil sample off is going to be one of the best ways to do that. Can you talk about solarizing tomatoes with sheets? If you mean sun protection, I wouldn't use a sheet. I'm not quite sure what you're meaning with solarizing tomatoes with sheets, though. Sorry. Soil bot testing kits, I wouldn't trust their results. Generally speaking, they're just not going to be very accurate. You're going to get a much better result from a lab. Pests. We are working on getting a whole bunch of really good resources up on the Grow and Give website for pests. If your broccoli leaves have lots of tiny holes in them, there's a couple pests it could be. It could be flea beetle. It could be cabbage looper. With a lot of the cole crops, covering them with a row cover is going to be one of your best ways to protect them. How much longer should you be succession planting cool season veg? If shade protected, can you keep planting all summer? It's going to be hard for the next 4 to 6 weeks to be very effective as you're succession planting your cool season veggies. Usually you'll want to take a break until about mid-July for those cool season crops, and then you can get started again. Do you need to rototill your garden every year? Generally speaking, it's not going to be best for the quality of your crops to rototill your garden every year. It's going to be better if you do it a little bit less frequently, but it's kind of up to you and up to the needs of your garden. You can definitely shoot us an email and we can work with you more individually. Tips for succession planting. I think I kind of already answered that. Are there warm season veggies that can still be sown this time of year? Yeah, you can definitely still put zucchini or summer squash, winter squash in. Beans could go in, especially if you're succession planting. I have a couple folks I know who succession plant zucchini because as they succumb to powdery mildew, the flavor starts to degrade. And so they just rope those old ones out and put new ones in. You can do that with bush beans as well. Are there plants that should not be planted next to each other? Generally speaking, no. The only thing we do recommend is rotating which crops go in which parts of your garden, just to help reduce disease pressures. Keeping arugula and spinach and basil from bolting. You can get a little bit of protection if you use a sunshade, suncloth, but unfortunately a lot of that is temperature, and when we're getting this hot so quickly, they're going to be bolting a little, and making sure that you keep them well watered. But 90+ degrees, they want to go to flower at that point. I'm going to trellis squash for the first time this year. Any hints? I really have seen a lot of success with the cattle fencing style of trellis. If you put that up, and you can sometimes even make it into a little bit of an arbor. It's a really sturdy material. Otherwise, I've seen really good stuff built with frames. And there's a lot of good guides online. Growing squash vertically is a great way to increase your yield in a small garden space, for sure. Linda, do I have experience with straw bale gardens? They are tough to get really good results in here in Colorado because of our dry climate. Flea beetles are not going away despite neem oil and diatomaceous earth. What else can I try? Make sure your plants are as healthy as possible so they can outgrow the damage. There's a few other things, but I still have 32 other questions, so I want to get into some of the others. I'm also curious about pest control. We could try and do a pest control something in the next coming weeks. I think we've done soil tests pretty well. A nutrient called Bush Doctor Sledgehammer made of saponin made from yucca. That is not a product I'm familiar with. Jasmine, can I talk about saving seeds from this year's harvest to plant next year? There are some crops that save better than others. Most important thing is that you need to know whether your plant is a hybrid or if it's open pollinated or an heirloom. If it's a hybrid, then it's not going to save well next year. Generally speaking, beans and tomatoes can be pretty good for saving. Your cucurbit crops, like your cucumbers, your melons, your squash, they're pretty promiscuous. They tend to cross-pollinate with each other really well, and so they're not good for seed saving unless you're being really carefully. Miracle-Gro, I thought Miracle-Gro was not to be used due to chemicals. Honestly, I don't recommend any specific fertilizer. Like I said, the plants don't really care what sources they're getting it from. I wasn't recommending Miracle-Gro necessarily. It's just one of the common products. The plants don't care. It's how you're using it and what your goals are in your own garden. My garden is covered in purslane. I thought it was a bonus plant and let it grow. Oh, yes. So for future use, if you're not planting seeds, you can do something like a pre-emergent product, but otherwise, discover a taste for it. It is one of those edible plants, so you can definitely use it for that purpose, but make sure that these new ones don't go to flower. You can pull them. They're really shallow rooted. They come out really easily. I'm interested in overwintering vegetables. Are there others that are good on the front range? There's a lot of good ones. Broccoli can, if you're using high tunnels and cold frames and that kind of thing, you can do kale, you can do, some broccolis will overwinter decently. I know some folks who've done cold frames around their artichokes and had some success. Generally speaking, some of those cold season crops. How many degrees does a double paned low hoop house get you? Off the top of my head, I would say somewhere between 5 and 20 degrees, depending on how you're managing it, what its size is, and that kind of thing. Does green mulch compete with new vegetable seedlings? I'd like to provide cover, but don't want to stress new veggies. Yeah, so if you have a cover crop, like a clover, you are definitely not going to get a lot of success with new seedlings in that space. You will need to turn that cover crop in before you put things out. Do you take wood chips out each year after harvest? I wouldn't recommend putting wood chips on your vegetable beds, rather having them in the pathways in between. If you really, really want them on your vegetable beds, yes, you would remove them completely each year at the end. Drip irrigation hoses would be placed underneath newspaper barrier, not over the top of newspaper. Soil for raised vegetable bed if you're starting from zero. If you're starting from zero, you can get it from a lot of the landscape supply companies. They'll deliver a load of topsoil for you. Okay, another webinar on harvesting. I see a couple points on that. We'll try and make sure that we get a harvest one. Why should drip emitters face upward? Ben, that's just so that you get the best possible spread of that watering. Recommendations for getting rid of bugs. They're eating my radish and cabbages in my raised beds. If you can get a grow cover on them, put PVC pipes over the area and cover them with a grow cover. That can be a good way to get a lot of bugs out of there. Also, encouraging beneficials can be a good way to go as well. Using a finer wood mulch such as shredded wood instead of chips. Once again, you've still got that issue. You don't want it to get turned in. So if you want to put it in and then pull it off at the end of the season, you can try it, but it's a little bit harder to work with. Using composted manure as a soil amendment. Manure is great. I didn't cover that because I figured we're kind of past that point this season, but composted manure can be a good way to add nutrients and organic material in your soil, but generally speaking, you just have to be aware of how much you're putting down. You never want to put more than an inch down because manure is higher in salts and can be problematic. We will be recording this talk, or we are recording this talk, so we'll be putting the recorded talk up so you can watch it that way. What does curing winter squash do? Curing is where you're prepping that plant to kind of shut its processes down. It's not going to be metabolizing as much, so it's going to store longer. I saw somewhere that vinegar kills weeds. Yes, vinegar definitely will kill weeds. It does not kill the weeds systemically though, so it's just going to burn down the top. The weed will regrow, and you're going to get better results from a horticulture grade vinegar, which I do have to warn you is very high acid, so you don't want to get it on your skin. You want to wear protective glasses and possibly a mask when you're applying it because it's very high acid. How much do you trim tomatoes and peppers? It depends on your goals and your needs. Peppers generally aren't going to need much in the way of pruning, but tomatoes, if they are an indeterminate tomato, are going to need a little bit of reining in so that they don't become a tree. And really, you can do that with a pair of sharp scissors and just kind of cut out the suckers and cut it to shape as you feel necessary. Is it okay to use Epsom salt in my garden? Only if you know that you've had a soil test and you have a deficiency in magnesium. Otherwise, it doesn't really do much. What percentage of light should be blocked at high elevations? 9,000 feet in a cold frame, 20%. That I'm not, off the top of my head, not very sure. Kelly, why don't you email me and we can work details out a little bit more. My email is on the slide. I planted a bunch of carrot seeds and had very few sprouts come up. What likely went wrong? Carrots are tricky. So carrots have very little force to push through the crust on soil surface. So if soil crusts at all, then even if that seed is successfully germinated, it's not going to punch through. I have some folks I've heard who put a layer of sand over the top. Some people put a wet piece of burlap over the top. Some people just go out and water it numerous times a day so no crust forms, but you need to do something like that. Are soaker hoses useful or drip irrigation is much better? Soaker hoses are drip irrigation. It's just a different form of drip irrigation. How should I use coffee grounds? It depends what your goal is. I would throw them into your compost if you have a compost pile and compost them up. Perennials in a container, how can we save them for next year? You can dig a hole and throw them in the ground and mulch them in, but would all of this apply to container gardening too? Yeah, most of this would apply to container gardening. Generally speaking, you know a little bit more about what is in your containers because you've put that media in yourself. But that can be, you definitely, most of the information I talked about here could apply to a container gardening. Perennials such as rhubarb, I'm not sure what you're asking. You could shoot me an email and get me a little bit more information. Any tips for controlling leaf miners? For those, the more quickly you can pick any leaves that you find leaf miners in, the more likely you are to cut their life cycle, or accept that you're getting some extra protein in your diet. I say that a little facetiously, but it also, I mean, when you're backyard gardening, sometimes it's a matter of working on your expectations. Beyond chicken wire, is there a good way to keep squirrels off produce? That would be that cayenne pepper. That can be a good one. Sawdust as mulch. I've seen that a few times. Sawdust can be a little bit dense, and so if it gets wet and turns into a solid mat, then it's not going to let much air through. At least that's some of what I've seen. I don't have any resources that I can point you to right off the bat right now, but if you want to shoot me an email and remind me, I can try and look up more information. I missed the Epsom salt comment. So Epsom salts, that's one. Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate, so it's a very good product if your soils are deficient in magnesium, which we rarely are. So it's not going to do anything for us unless your soils are deficient in magnesium. Squirrels are digging up my veggies. Could I sprinkle coffee grounds around my plants? I don't think coffee grounds are going to do very much. I do know they don't like any members of the allium family, so planting onions in a little bit more locations would be helpful. Does hilling up potatoes help produce more potatoes? Yes, it does. You can generally do it at least twice, sometimes 3 times, before the plant loses its oomph, but you do want to do it when just the first few leaves have branched over. On the Grow and Give website, we do have some really good resources for growing potatoes. You can go watch some webinars on there that are recorded. I've noticed some small holes in my lettuce leaves. Any suggestions? It could be something like a flea beetle. It could be earwigs. It could be, I've seen a little bit of roly-polies working on a few things this year. But it's really hard to say unless you can find the actual critter doing the damage. It could be worthwhile if you go out at night with a flashlight and shine your light on and see if you can find anybody. If your garden's relatively moist, it could also be slugs. There's a lot of different things. Oh, one of my favorite questions. Mites for controlling bindweed. There are mites for controlling bindweed. They are very effective in unirrigated areas. If it's in a vegetable garden, they're not going to do anything. The bindweed will outgrow them. Tips for rhubarb. Rhubarb's a perennial plant. It grows pretty well here. It doesn't like the peak heat of our summer, but it's a nice perennial. I don't really have time to get into the planting and care of it, but it's a nice plant. Might be getting a little late this year to plant it, but you could try and get one in the fall or plan for next spring. Which plants are squirrels after? Honestly, squirrels go after a lot of things. They're pretty indiscriminate. Eric, do you mind throwing the Grow and Give website up? It's growandgivecolorado.org. Does burning weeds do anything? Yeah, you can definitely burn weeds back if you can do it in a safe manner, especially now that we're heating up and drying out. It's not something I generally recommend, and be aware that it just burns the plant back. It doesn't actually kill the root of the plant. I researched Back to Eden gardening style wood that claims wood chips are the best mulch to apply to vegetable beds. Wood chips can be pretty good as a mulch, but you have that factor that you have to pull them off at the end of the year if you want to do any work in the garden bed and to get the garden bed nice and cleaned out for the season. I'm putting rhubarb, oh, you amended your rhubarb question. I'm putting rhubarb in a big container by my garden. How do I save it in the container or dig out or bring inside? Honestly, I would just put it in the ground. Rhubarb is not one that's going to be quite as good in a pot as it is in the ground. If you've got a space you can put it in the ground, I would say do so. Ladybug benefits. Ladybugs are a voracious eater of pests like aphids, but they do a lot better as larvae than they do as adults. If you Google ladybug larvae, you can see what they look like. They look pretty creepy, but they will eat a ton of aphids. They're really good for you. Where can you find the bindweed mites? You can get them from the Palisade insectary, but it's like I said, if you've got any irrigation on it, they're not going to do much of anything. Used neem oil to kill mites and it killed my mint. Anything I should be more careful in the future? Definitely always read the label and always read the instructions before you apply any pesticide to anything so that you know that you're using it in an appropriate manner. If there are few bees around, you assume your flowers get pollinated. Generally speaking, if you plant it, they will come. Bees are going to help with your pollination, but if you really want to help it, I did do a talk a few weeks back on pollinators in the vegetable garden. If you check out our YouTube page, you can probably see that. I think I got it uploaded on there, and the more flowers you can get up and out and around, the better you will be doing in terms of getting them into your vegetable garden as well. The Grow and Give website produce count is missing something. Some things I'm growing like pie pumpkins and tomatillos. Are these still okay to donate? Definitely. We currently are working on a melon and squash talk, which we'll be getting up in the next few days. We're having a whole slew of vacations going on at the moment, so things are a little delayed. But yes, you can definitely donate. Just double check with your the places that you're donating. Okay, I think I'm almost caught up. Japanese beetle, will continuous hand picking get rid of them over the years, or are my grapes doomed forever? Oh, Japanese beetles are going to be a tricky one because hand picking is effective. Each adult you pull out of the system is an adult that's not going to lay eggs and produce for next year. So it is an effective control measure. Don't stop, but it's a big scary pest that's definitely in our future and probably going to be around. So we've got a lot of really good resources on extension regarding Japanese beetle. I planted 4 fruit trees this year. I need more than one of each of them to pollinate. Pear, peach, plum, apple, grafted 4 branches. That's a bit bigger question than I have time to answer in our next couple of minutes. If you want to shoot me an email, we can work through a little bit more. I will say your pear and your apples will pollinate each other if they're blooming at the same time. A lot of plums are self-fruitful, so that can be useful. Do marigolds help with pests? There's not much research substantiation behind that, but they can draw in beneficials, which can help a little bit. Any suggestions on how to treat the holes in your lettuce? You need to know the cause before you can treat, definitely, yes. There's some pests like a spider mite. If you treated a spider mite with traditional insecticides that would get rid of aphids and that kind of thing, you're actually going to make the spider mite problem worse. And that happens with several other examples. That's just the easy top of my head one. And it's definitely it could potentially make things worse if you treat without knowing what is causing the problems. When I'm starting a new bed in the ground, how deep should it be tilled? You want to till as deep as your deepest rooting area. The deepest thing I usually grow are parsnips, which will get about 18 inches. So as deep as you can. All right, I think our time is up, so I'm going to respect everybody else's time. I'm also desperate for a drink of water. So thank you guys so much, and hope we do have a poll, if you don't mind taking a quick poll for us, which I think Eric will get up for us.
We already have.
You already did that? All right, yep. Perfect. I don't see it as the speaker. So thank you guys so much. We will be back next week talking about compost, and we will be working up another series, hopefully for the following month. We'll see where we're at that point. And happy gardening. I hope that everybody has a great time, and share pictures on our Facebook page. We love to see them. Thank you so much.